The forest had gone silent in the way only winter can command. It wasn't the absence of sound, but the presence of something heavier, snow falling in thick, muffling curtains that swallowed every cry, every rustle, every breath. The trees stood, like frozen sentinels, their branches bowed under the weight of ice, and the world felt suspended between twilight and dream. David had been walking the perimeter of his sanctuary for nearly 2 hours, his boots crunching through snow that reached past his ankles, his breath forming clouds that dissolved into the gray air. He wasn't looking for anything in particular, he never was. But 20 years of working with wounded animals had taught him that the forest spoke in whispers, and if you listened carefully enough, you could hear when something was wrong. He stopped near the edge of the clearing where the pines grew dense and the undergrowth tangled into shadows. Something had caught his attention, not a sound, but the absence of one, a stillness that felt different from the rest. He turned slowly, scanning the tree line, and that's when he saw it. A shape dark against the white, barely visible beneath. A fallen spruce. At first he thought it might be a shadow, a trick of the fading light. But then the shape moved just slightly, and he felt his heart tighten in his chest. He approached carefully, his hand instinctively moving to the radio clipped to his belt, though he knew there was no one close enough to help. The snow had been falling for 3 days straight, and the roads leading to the sanctuary were buried. He was alone out here, and whatever was beneath that tree was alone too. As he drew closer, the shape began to take form, a long, sleek body, midnight black, dusted with snow, a panther. A black panther, her sides rising and falling in shallow, labored breaths, and tucked against her belly, barely moving, were 2 tiny cubs. David's breath caught. He had seen plenty of injured animals in his years as a rescuer, but this was different. Black panthers were rare in this region, elusive and powerful, and to find one like this collapsed, vulnerable, with newborns, it felt like stumbling into something sacred and heartbreaking all at once. He crouched down slowly, keeping his movements soft, non-threatening. The mother's eyes flickered open, amber and dull with exhaustion, and she watched him with a gaze that held no fight, only weariness. She didn't growl, she didn't bare her teeth. She simply looked at him, and in that look, he understood she was dying, and if he didn't do something, her cubs would die with her. He spoke to her in a low, steady voice, the kind he'd used 1,000 times before with frightened animals. He told her he wasn't going to hurt her. He told her he wanted to help. He wasn't sure if she understood the words, but he hoped she might understand the tone, the intention behind them. Slowly, he reached out, letting her see his hand, letting her catch his scent. It didn't move. Her breathing was too shallow, her body too weak. The cubs, no bigger than his forearm, were barely stirring, their fur damp and cold against her belly. David knew he had to act quickly. Hypothermia was setting in, and if he waited any longer, it would be too late. He shed his heavy coat and carefully wrapped it around the cubs first, lifting them gently away from their mother. They mewed softly, tiny helpless sounds that pierced through the cold air. The mother's eyes followed his movements, but she didn't resist. She didn't have the strength. He bundled the cubs against his chest, feeling their fragile heartbeat through the fabric, and then turned his attention back to the panther. Getting her back to the sanctuary would be the hard part. She was bigger than he'd anticipated. He's 120 pounds and dead weight in a weakened state. He radioed back to the cabin, knowing no one would answer, but leaving a message anyway in case someone checked in. Then he did the only thing he could. He slid his arms beneath her body, bracing himself, and lifted. She was heavy, but not impossibly so, and he moved slowly, step by step, carrying her through the snow. The walk back felt endless. His arms burned, his legs ached, and the cold bit through his flannel shirt, but he didn't stop. He kept his eyes on the faint lights of the cabin in the distance, kept his breathing steady, kept whispering to the panther that she was going to be okay. He wasn't sure if he believed it, but he needed to say it. The cubs stirred occasionally, against his chest, their small bodies trembling, and he held them tighter, willing his warmth into them. When he finally reached the cabin, he kicked the door open and stumbled inside, the heat from the wood stove hitting him like a wave. He laid the panther down on a thick pile of blankets near the fire, her body limp and unresponsive, and then carefully placed the cubs beside her for a moment. He just stood there, breathing hard, his hands shaking from exertion and adrenaline. Then he got to work. He checked the mother first. Her temperature was dangerously low, her pulse faint and irregular. He wrapped her in heated blankets, layering them carefully, and positioned her as close to the fire as he dared without overheating her. Then he turned to the cubs. They were cold, too cold, their tiny bodies barely generating warmth. He filled hot water bottles, wrapped them in towels, and tucked them around the cubs, creating a nest of heat. He mixed a makeshift formula: goat's milk, egg yolk, a touch of honey, and used a syringe to coax a few drops into their mouths. They suckled weakly, but they suckled, and that was something hours past. David sat on the floor beside them, monitoring their breathing, adjusting blankets, adding wood to the fire. The storm outside howled against the windows, but inside, the cabin was warm and quiet, filled only with the crackling of flames and the soft sounds of labored breathing. The mother hadn't moved. Her eyes were closed, her body still, and David found himself watching the rise and fall of her chest, counting each breath like a prayer. Sometime after midnight, she stirred. It was subtle, a twitch of her ear, a shift in her posture, but it was movement, and it was life. David leaned forward, his heart picking up pace. Her eyes opened slowly, amber and clearer now, and she looked at him. Really looked at him. There was still wariness there, still caution, but something else too, something that might have been recognition. She turned her head toward her cubs, and a rumbling sound came from deep in her chest, not a growl, but a vocalization, a call. The cubs responded with tiny mews, wriggling against the blankets. David stayed very still. He didn't want to startle her, didn't want to break whatever fragile trust was forming. She watched him for a long moment, her gaze steady, and then, slowly, she lowered her head and nuzzled her cubs. They crawled toward her, drawn by instinct and warmth, and latched onto her, nursing. David felt something tighten in his throat. She was letting them feed. She was responding. She was fighting. He stood up quietly and moved to the other side of the room, giving her space. He prepared a dish of raw meat and set it within her reach, along with a bowl of water. She didn't touch it immediately, but her eyes followed the food, and after a few minutes, she stretched her neck forward and took a tentative bite. It wasn't much, but it was enough. She was eating, she was drinking, she was alive. By morning, the storm had passed. Pale sunlight filtered through the windows, casting soft shadows across the cabin floor. David hadn't slept. He'd kept vigil through the night, watching over the Panther and her cubs, monitoring every breath, every movement. The mother was stronger. Now, her breathing had steadied, her eyes were brighter, and she'd eaten most of the meat he'd left for her. The cubs were nursing regularly, the small bodies warm and wriggling with life. David sat in a chair near the window, a mug of coffee in his hands, and watched them. The Panther lay curled around her cubs, her body relaxed, her tail wrapped protectively over them. She looked at him occasionally, her gaze no longer wary, but calm, maybe even grateful. He wasn't sure. Animals didn't show gratitude the way humans did, but there was something in the way she watched him, something in the way she allowed him to be there, that felt like trust. He knew he couldn't keep them forever. They were wild, and they belonged in the wild. But for now, they were safe. For now, they were warm, and for now, that was enough. He took a sip of his coffee and let himself feel what he hadn't allowed himself to feel until this deep, overwhelming relief. He'd found them in time. He'd brought them back. And somehow, against all odds, they were going to be okay.